My brother stole my fiancée by spreading lies about me. I gathered evidence of his manipulation and confronted him at his engagement party. That was 3 months ago. Today, he's begging me to forgive him as she left him too. You know how they say blood is thicker than water? Yeah, well, that saying went straight out the window the day my own brother decided to torpedo my entire life for real. I'm talking about a betrayal so deep it made me question everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and the people you're supposed to trust most in this world. Let me paint you the picture of how this whole mess started. 3 years ago, I was on top of the world, had just gotten engaged to Sarah, this absolutely incredible woman I'd been dating for 2 years. We're talking the whole package here. Smart as a whip, funny, gorgeous, and she could throw back a Bud Light with the best of them during our weekend barbecues. We had our whole future mapped out, from the wedding venue to the little house with the white picket fence and maybe a golden retriever named Max. My brother Jake had always been the jealous type, but I never thought he'd go nuclear on my happiness. Growing up, he was constantly competing with me over everything. Grades, sports, girls, you name it. But we were adults now, right? I figured all that sibling rivalry nonsense was behind us. Boy, was I wrong. It started small, like these things. Always do. Jake would make little comments whenever Sarah was around, subtle digs about my work ethic, jokes about how I was punching above my weight class with her, that kind of garbage. I brushed it off because honestly, I thought he was just being his usual annoying self. Sarah and I would laugh about it later, and she'd always reassure me that Jake was probably just feeling left out or whatever. The first real red flag should have been when Jake started showing up everywhere we went. Date night at that Italian place downtown. There's Jake at the bar claiming he just happened to be in the neighborhood. Sarah's birthday party at my apartment. Jake arrives early and stays late, playing the charming brother-in-law role to perfection. Weekend trip to the lake. Guess who suddenly had the same weekend free and wanted to tag along? Sarah, bless her heart, thought it was sweet that Jake wanted to be more involved in our lives. She'd always wanted a close-knit family, coming from a pretty dysfunctional background herself, so she ate up all his attention like it was the most natural thing in the world. Meanwhile, I'm getting this weird gut feeling that something's off, but I can't put my finger on it. It's like when you smell smoke but can't find the fire, you know? Update. Thanks for all the support, everyone. Reading your comments is helping me process this whole situation. Some of you asked about the timeline. This all went down over about 8 months before I finally caught on. Looking back, I feel pretty stupid for not seeing it sooner. But here's the thing that's really eating at me. Should I have seen this coming from Jake? We grew up together, shared a room until we were teenagers, and I thought I knew him inside and out. How do you prepare for betrayal from someone you trusted completely? The manipulation really ramped up around month 4 of this sick game Jake was playing. He started having these private conversations with Sarah about me, always when I wasn't around, naturally. He'd pull her aside at family gatherings, text her when I was at work, even called her a few times under the guise of planning surprise parties or whatever excuse he could cook up. What I didn't know at the time was that Jake was systematically poisoning the well, feeding Sarah carefully crafted lies about my character, my past, and my intentions. He told her I had a gambling problem back in college that I'd hidden from her. Complete fabrication, by the way. The biggest bet I'd ever placed was $20 on the Super Bowl. He claimed I'd cheated on previous girlfriends, which was also total garbage since I'd only had 2 serious relationships before Sarah, both of which ended amicably for completely unrelated reasons. But the masterpiece of his deception was convincing Sarah that I was having second thoughts about our engagement. Jake told her he was worried about me because I'd been asking him questions about whether marriage was really worth it, whether I was too young to settle down, all this fabricated nonsense that played right into Sarah's deepest insecurities about commitment. The crazy part is how good Jake was at this. He never came right out and said I was a bad guy. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he positioned himself as the concerned brother who was just looking out for Sarah's best interests. He'd say things like, I love my brother, but I've seen him do this before. Or, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I think you deserve to know. Classic manipulation tactics, right out of the playbook. And Sarah, who already had trust issues from her parents' messy divorce, started believing every word. I started noticing changes in Sarah around month 6. She became distant, questioning, always seeming like she was waiting for me to slip up or prove Jake's lies true. Our conversations became minefields where innocent comments would trigger these intense discussions about commitment and honesty. She'd ask me pointed questions about my past, my finances, my feelings about marriage, all stuff we'd already talked through extensively. The worst part was watching Jake comfort her during these manufactured crises. Whenever Sarah and I had a fights that I now realize Jake was orchestrating behind the scenes, he'd be right there with a shoulder to cry on and more poison to pour in her ear. I remember one particularly brutal evening when Sarah and I had gotten into it over something completely ridiculous. I think I'd forgotten to call her during my lunch break or something equally trivial. She stormed out of my apartment in tears, and I found out later that she went straight to Jake's place. They spent hours talking, with Jake playing the role of supportive brother-in-law while simultaneously reinforcing every doubt he'd planted in her mind. By month 7, I could feel Sarah slipping away, but I had no idea why. Every attempt I made to fix things seemed to backfire. When I tried to be more attentive, she accused me of overcompensating for something. When I gave her space, she said it proved I didn't care enough to fight for the relationship. It was like being trapped in some twisted psychological maze with no exit. The breaking point came on what should have been one of the happiest days of our lives, finalizing details for our wedding venue. We were supposed to put down the deposit on this beautiful place overlooking the river, the same spot where I'd proposed to her under the stars 8 months earlier. Instead of excitement, Sarah seemed anxious and withdrawn during the entire meeting. When the wedding planner asked about our timeline, Sarah hesitated and said she needed more time to think. My heart dropped into my stomach right there in that perfectly decorated conference room. That night, Sarah broke up with me. She gave me this whole speech about how she couldn't marry someone she didn't fully trust, how she'd learned things about me that made her question everything, how maybe we were just too different to make it work long term. Through her tears, she kept apologizing and saying she wished things could be different, but she couldn't ignore the red flags any longer. Red flags that didn't exist until Jake created them. I was devastated, confused, and completely blindsided. I spent the next week calling in sick to work, living on leftover pizza and beer, trying to figure out where everything had gone wrong. My mom kept calling to check on me, and even she seemed confused about the breakup since she'd always thought Sarah and I were perfect together. It was during one of these conversations with Mom that she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. She said Jake had been asking a lot of questions about Sarah lately, whether she seemed happy, if she'd said anything about having doubts, that kind of thing. Mom thought it was sweet that Jake cared so much about his future sister-in-law's well-being. That's when the pieces started clicking together. Update. The comments asking about proof are spot on. I knew I needed evidence before I could confront anyone. What happened next was like something out of a detective movie, except it was my real life falling apart. I'm getting to the part where I started investigating, and honestly what I found was worse than I imagined. Some of you mentioned similar experiences with family members, and reading those stories is both heartbreaking and validating. How do you even begin to rebuild trust after something like this? I started paying attention, really paying attention, to Jake's behavior patterns. I began noticing things that had probably been happening all along, but that I'd been too trusting or too naive to pick up on, like how Jake always seemed to know details about my relationship with Sarah that I'd never shared with him, or how he'd make subtle comments that seemed designed to plant seeds of doubt, or how he was always available whenever Sarah needed someone to talk to, almost like he was waiting for those moments. The real breakthrough came when I decided to do some digital detective work. I still had access to our shared family Netflix account, and I noticed Jake had been watching a lot of relationship and psychology content, stuff about manipulation tactics, how to read people, how to build trust and influence. Not exactly his usual lineup of action movies and sports documentaries. But the smoking gun came from an unexpected source, Sarah's best friend, Emma. Emma had always liked me and had been just as shocked as everyone else about our breakup. She reached out a couple weeks after Sarah and I split, asking if I wanted to grab coffee and talk. She said Sarah had been acting strange for months before our breakup, and she was worried about her. During that coffee date, Emma dropped a bomb that changed everything. She told me that Sarah had been getting advice from Jake about our relationship, and that Jake had been sharing concerns about me that didn't match up with the person Emma knew me to be. Emma said she'd tried to tell Sarah that Jake's stories didn't make sense, but Sarah was so invested in trusting him that she shut down any criticism. More importantly, Emma mentioned that Jake had recently asked Sarah out on what he called a friendly dinner to help her through the breakup. Sarah had told Emma she was thinking about going because Jake had been so supportive during this difficult time. My stomach dropped. I realized that Jake hadn't just destroyed my relationship for kicks. He'd done it because he wanted Sarah for himself. I asked Emma if she'd be willing to help me figure out the truth, and she agreed immediately. She was as angry as I was about the manipulation, especially seeing how much pain Sarah was in over our breakup. Emma's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. She told Sarah she was concerned about her emotional state and suggested that Sarah should be careful about rebounding too quickly with anyone, even someone as trustworthy as Jake. Then Emma asked Sarah to walk her through exactly what Jake had told her about me, claiming she wanted to understand what had gone wrong so she could be a better friend. Sarah, thinking she was confiding in her best friend, laid out the entire web of lies Jake had spun. The gambling problem, the cheating, history, the commitment issues, all of it. Emma recorded the conversation on her phone with Sarah's permission, telling her she wanted to make sure she was remembering everything correctly so she could give the best advice. When Emma played me that recording, I felt like I was listening to someone describe a completely different person. Jake had been thorough, I'll give him that. He'd crafted a version of me that was just believable enough that someone with existing trust issues might buy into it, but just false enough that anyone who actually knew me would spot the lies immediately. The recording also revealed that Jake had been pushing hard for Sarah to move on with someone who really understood her and cared about her well-being. Someone like, I don't know, him. Sarah had admitted to Emma that she was confused about her feelings for Jake. She said he'd been so kind and supportive during the breakup that she was starting to see him in a different light. She even mentioned that Jake had told her he'd always thought they had a special connection and that maybe everything happened for a reason. Listening to that recording was like watching a master manipulator at work. Jake had systematically destroyed my relationship, positioned himself as Sarah's emotional support system, and was now moving in for the kill. And Sarah, still reeling from our breakup and grateful for his support, was walking right into his trap. I spent the next week gathering more evidence. I started taking screenshots of Jake's social media activity, documenting the timeline of his involvement in our relationship, and building a case that would be impossible to deny. The most damning piece of evidence came from Jake himself. He'd gotten sloppy in his confidence, and during a family dinner, he made a comment about how he'd always known Sarah was too good for me and how some things are just meant to be. When my dad asked what he meant, Jake quickly backtracked, but I caught it on my phone's voice recorder. I also discovered that Jake had been liking and commenting on Sarah's social media posts almost immediately after they went up, something he'd never done before our breakup. He was also posting things that seemed designed to get her attention, quotes about being there for people during difficult times, photos of places they'd been together as a group, stuff that looked innocent on the surface but felt calculated when you knew what was really going on. The final straw was when Emma told me that Jake had officially asked Sarah out on a proper date, not just a supportive friend dinner. Sarah had said yes. That's when I knew I had to act. Update. All right, everyone, here's where things get intense. I had all the evidence I needed, but I wasn't sure how to handle the confrontation. Some of you suggested going straight to Sarah. Others said to expose Jake publicly. I ended up doing something that surprised even me. The engagement party I mentioned in the preview? Yeah, that's coming up next, and it's going to be a doozy. I'm still processing what happened that night, but I can tell you this. The truth has a way of coming out, even when people try their hardest to bury it. I decided that Jake deserved to face the consequences of his actions in front of the people who mattered most. But I also knew that Sarah deserved to hear the truth, even if it was going to hurt. My plan was risky, but I felt like it was the only way to make sure Jake couldn't spin his way out of this one. I waited until Jake and Sarah had been dating for about 6 weeks. During that time, Emma kept me updated on how things were progressing. Apparently, Sarah was struggling with guilt about dating her ex-fiancé's brother so soon after our breakup, but Jake kept reassuring her that I was moving on and that life was too short to let arbitrary social rules dictate their happiness. Jake was also love-bombing Sarah hard, expensive dinners, surprise flowers, weekend getaways, the whole 9 yards. He was trying to sweep her off her feet before she had time to think too clearly about the situation. Classic manipulator move. The opportunity I'd been waiting for came when Jake announced to the family that he and Sarah were engaged. After 6 weeks of dating. He claimed it was love at first sight, and that he'd realized Sarah was his soulmate all along. My parents were confused but supportive, probably figuring that if Sarah made one son happy, maybe she was meant to be with the other. They didn't know about Jake's manipulation campaign, so from their perspective, it just looked like a complicated but ultimately happy ending. Jake planned this huge engagement party at his apartment, inviting all our mutual friends, family members, and of course Sarah's friends, including Emma. He was so confident in his victory that he even invited me, probably thinking I'd be too heartbroken or embarrassed to show up. He was wrong. I showed up to that party with a folder full of evidence, and a plan that I'd rehearsed a dozen times in my head. Emma had agreed to help by making sure Sarah would be in the right spot at the right time to hear everything. The party was in full swing when I arrived. Jake was playing the role of devoted fiancé to perfection, his arm around Sarah as he told the story of their unexpected but destined love to anyone who would listen. Sarah looked beautiful but uncomfortable, like part of her knew something wasn't quite right but couldn't put her finger on what. I waited until Jake called for everyone's attention to make a toast. He stood up in front of the whole room, champagne glass raised, talking about how grateful he was for the twists of fate that had brought him and Sarah together. That's when I stood up. Before you make that toast, Jake, I think everyone should know the real story of how you and Sarah got together. The room went dead silent. Jake's face went white, then red, then white again. Sarah looked confused and embarrassed, probably thinking I was about to make some kind of jealous scene. I pulled out my phone and started playing the recording Emma had made of Sarah describing all the lies Jake had told her about me. Sarah's own voice filled the room, detailing the gambling problem that never existed, the cheating history that was completely fabricated, the commitment issues that Jake had invented out of thin air. You could have heard a pin drop. When the recording finished, I looked directly at Jake and said, "Would you like to explain to everyone how you knew all these things about me that never actually happened?" Jake tried to bluff his way through it, claiming the recording was taken out of context, that he'd just been trying to protect Sarah from getting hurt, but I was ready for that. I pulled out the screenshots of his social media activity, the timeline I'd created showing how his involvement in our relationship had escalated, and the recordings I'd made of his suspicious comments at family dinners. But the real knockout punch came when I played the recording of Jake telling Sarah that he'd always known she was too good for me and that some things are just meant to be. His own words, clearly showing that he'd been planning this for months. Sarah's face went through about 10 different emotions in the span of 30 seconds. Confusion, realization, anger, hurt, embarrassment. It was like watching someone's entire world crumble in real time. She looked at Jake and said, "Is this true? Did you lie to me about all those things?" Jake tried to backtrack, tried to make it seem like he'd just been concerned, and maybe misremembered some details. But the evidence was overwhelming, and everyone in that room could see exactly what had happened. Sarah took off her engagement ring and set it on the coffee table. She looked at Jake with disgust and said, "I can't believe I trusted you. I can't believe I let you manipulate me into throwing away the best relationship I ever had." Then she looked at me, tears streaming down her face, and said, "I am so sorry. I was so stupid, and I'm so sorry." The party broke up pretty quickly after that. Jake tried to follow Sarah as she left, but she told him never to contact her again. Most of the guests left without saying goodbye to anyone, probably feeling awkward about witnessing such a personal drama. My parents stayed behind to talk to Jake, and I could hear them in the kitchen asking him how he could do something so horrible to his own brother. Jake kept trying to justify his actions, claiming he'd really fallen in love with Sarah and that he thought she'd be happier with him anyway. That was 3 months ago. In the weeks that followed, Sarah tried multiple times to reconcile with me. She sent long text messages explaining how sorry she was, how she'd been manipulated and confused, how she wanted to work things out and rebuild our relationship. But here's the thing. Even though I understood that she'd been manipulated, I couldn't get past the fact that she'd been so willing to believe horrible things about me without ever giving me a chance to defend myself. Every time I thought about taking her back, I remembered how quickly she'd turned against me based on lies from someone who barely knew me compared to how long we'd been together. Trust, once broken, is incredibly hard to rebuild, and I realized that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life wondering if Sarah would believe the next person who came along with a convincing story about my character flaws. So I told her I appreciated her apology, but that too much damage had been done for us to go back to what we had before. Jake, meanwhile, went into full damage control mode. He tried to convince our parents that he'd made some mistakes, but that his feelings for Sarah were genuine. He claimed that he'd only lied because he was afraid Sarah would reject him if she knew how he really felt. Our parents weren't buying it. They'd raised us to value honesty and loyalty, and what Jake had done violated everything they'd taught us about treating people with respect. My dad, especially, was disgusted by Jake's manipulation tactics and told him he was ashamed to call him his son. Jake also lost most of his friends over this. Word spread quickly about what had happened at the engagement party, and people started distancing themselves from him. Nobody wants to be close to someone who's capable of that level of calculated deception, especially when it involves destroying a family member's happiness. The breaking point for Jake came about 2 weeks ago. He'd been trying to rebuild his reputation and move on with his life, but the social consequences of his actions were proving to be more severe than he'd anticipated. He'd lost Sarah, his family's respect, most of his friends, and he was struggling at work because people there had heard about the situation too. He showed up at my apartment on a Tuesday night, looking like he hadn't slept in days. He was crying, apologizing, begging me to forgive him and help him put our family back together. He told me that losing Sarah had been devastating, but losing his family was unbearable. He said he'd made a terrible mistake and that he'd do anything to make it right. I let him talk for about 20 minutes, listening to him plead his case and promise that he'd changed. Then I told him something that I'd been thinking about for months. I said that forgiveness isn't the same thing as trust, and that while I might eventually be able to forgive him for what he did, I would never trust him again. I told him that trust is the foundation of any relationship, whether it's romantic, familial, or friendship, and that he'd proven himself capable of destroying that foundation for his own selfish gain. I also told him that actions have consequences, and that the consequences of his choices weren't just affecting him, they were affecting Sarah, our parents, our extended family, and everyone who cared about both of us. Jake asked what he could do to earn back my trust, and I told him honestly that I didn't think there was anything he could do. Some betrayals are too deep to come back from, especially when they're as calculated and sustained as what he'd done to me and Sarah. He left that night looking defeated, and I haven't heard from him since. The truth is, I don't know if I'll ever be able to have a normal relationship with Jake again. He's my brother, and part of me will always love him, but he's also someone who proved himself capable of deliberately destroying my happiness for his own benefit. How do you move forward from something like that? Our parents have been trying to mediate between us, but I've told them that I need space and time to figure out how I feel about everything. They understand, even if they're heartbroken about their family being torn apart. As for me, I'm doing better than I expected. The betrayal hurt like hell, but there's something liberating about knowing the truth and not having to wonder what went wrong or blame myself for the relationship falling apart. I've started dating again, taking things slow and being more careful about red flags and trust issues. I've also been going to therapy to work through the family stuff and make sure I don't carry this baggage into future relationships. Sarah reached out one more time about a month ago, asking if we could meet for coffee and talk about everything that happened. I agreed, partly out of curiosity and partly because I thought it might help both of us get some closure. She looked good, healthier and more like herself than she had in the months before our breakup. She apologized again, more thoughtfully this time, acknowledging not just that she'd been manipulated, but that she'd made choices along the way that had hurt me. She told me that the experience had taught her a lot about her own vulnerabilities and trust issues, and that she was also in therapy working on those things. She said she didn't expect me to take her back, but that she wanted me to know she understood now what Jake had done and how wrong she'd been to believe his lies without talking to me first. I appreciated her honesty and her growth, but I also confirmed that our romantic relationship was definitely over. Too much had happened, and we'd both changed too much to go back to who we were before. We parted on good terms, though, which felt like the right way to close that chapter of my life. Looking back on everything that happened, I think the hardest part wasn't losing Sarah or even being betrayed by Jake. The hardest part was learning that someone I'd trusted completely was capable of such calculated cruelty. But here's what I've learned from this whole mess. You can't control other people's actions, but you can control how you respond to them. You can choose whether to let betrayal make you bitter or make you stronger. You can choose whether to close your heart or open it more carefully. I chose to get stronger and more careful, but not to close my heart completely. And you know what? I'm happier now than I was before any of this happened. I have better boundaries, better self-awareness, and better judgment about people's character. I know what real loyalty looks like, and I know what red flags to watch for. Jake is still my brother, and maybe someday we'll find a way to have some kind of relationship again. But it will never be the same, and I'm okay with that. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. They can only be replaced with something completely different. As for Sarah, I genuinely hope she finds happiness with someone who deserves her trust. She made mistakes, but she was also a victim of Jake's manipulation. I don't wish her any harm, even if I can't be the person who shares her future. The bottom line is this. My brother's betrayal cost him everything he thought he wanted, and it taught me everything I needed to know about the kind of person I want to be and the kind of people I want in my life. Sometimes the worst things that happen to you end up being the best things that could have happened to you, even if it takes a while to see it that way. And sometimes, the people who hurt you the most end up teaching you the most valuable lessons about strength, forgiveness, and moving forward. 3 months ago, Jake was begging me to forgive him as his world fell apart around him. Today, I'm building a better life without him in it, and that feels like the right choice for both of us.